Beacon Press Audio presents Fat and Furious by Breanne Fahs. This audiobook is narrated by Victoria Connolly. Published by Beacon Press Audio, 2025. Introduction. On Becoming Fat and Furious. A friend of mine likes to say, "No one is born a radical. You have to become radical by living in the world and suffering from its logics." The fury that I feel about fatness, when I think about the everyday traumas and oppressions fat people endure, the possibilities that are limited and foreclosed by virtue of living in a fat body, is not some kind of inevitability. I did not start my life as radical, fat, or a feminist. Fury is also a kind of becoming. It requires ignition. It is underlaid by loss and grief, recognition of injustice, and a rejection of self-loathing. It comes from an instinct to survive and protect, but also to expand, to push outward. Fury transforms and breaks, shakes and disturbs. It works against alienation, isolation, and depression, and toward humanity, collectivity, and justice. People grow into fatness, sometimes slowly, sometimes not, but always against the current of a culture that is painfully anxious about that growth. For those who live in fat bodies, the becoming of their fatness has many different trajectories and paths, set against a backdrop of subtle and not so subtle metrics for what is too much and too big. For some, this becoming arrives in childhood, with parents and doctors and peers undermining a sense of bodily freedom and autonomy. Some become fat during adolescence, fatness arriving in tandem with burgeoning desire and sexuality. Others grow into fatness during their adulthood, no longer bolstered by the metabolism of their youth. This becoming, at any age, suggests that we emerge as fat and then make sense of it, that we have to shape our understanding of the world around our changing bodies. We are often ill-equipped to do so, with very little, if any, structural or social support to conceptualize or care for ourselves. Instead, we are inundated by anti-fat messaging, institutionalized sizeism, and complicated, multi-layered stories of gender, race, class, sexuality, and ability. Some of us live an entire life in denial of that becoming, taking up the common tropes of battling or defeating our own fatness. To live as fat is often a state of eternal becoming, laced with messages of failure, deviance, risk, and violation. And yet, fatness also carries with it so many narratives outside the typical stories that link fatness and deviance. Fatness is love, affinity, affection, strength, similarity, humor, work, and life. This collision has produced in me a relentless defiance about the ideal shape of bodies. The dread and terror that people impose upon fat bodies still feels strange and abhorrent to me. I feel disoriented by the ire directed toward fat women, even though I know all too well I am reduced by it. I find it impossible to see anti-fatness as an inevitability or a default setting. Fury is a refusal to accept what is at the expense of what could be. I want this book, and the voices within it, to establish a chorus of permanent opposition to that which denigrates fat bodies, even as we all sort out the stakes and possibilities of complicity and resistance. I want to understand what we carry. If there is to be any joy in fatness, any course correction for the linking of fat bodies with dread and fear, any rectifying the connections between anti-fatness and objection, it will require a closer consideration of fat bodies as identities of resistance and spaces of fury. In this book, I approach fatness on multiple levels, within the context of feminist politics, activism, and body politics. I argue that fatness operates as an imaginary fear, as lived experience, as a projection screen for political battles about bodies, and as a site of possibilities for resistance. As such, I work to not delineate fat and thin as a dichotomy, but as a continuum, a fantasy and a projection, and, of course, as material conditions. The popular story we see today in nearly every aspect of rhetoric around gender and fatness is that the best and most radical thing one can do about fatness is to either accept one's own fatness, see Jennifer Weiner's memoirs, talk openly about fatness as an outgrowth of trauma, see Roxane Gay's Hunger, or use fatness to inspire exercise and dieting regimens. Self-love and self-acceptance dominate the landscape of individualistic solutions to the problem of fat negativity. If only people practiced body positivity and body acceptance, they could, within these frameworks, escape the problems of fat shame and fat negativity. The obvious omission at the center of these mainstream discourses is the social and structural critique of anti-fat rhetoric and the material consequences of fat misogyny. Economic, romantic, social, and more. This is driven by an even broader failure to understand how women in particular feel terrorized by fatness, and how fatness is used not only as a weapon to perpetuate sexism, but as a tool to exacerbate tensions about race, class, and sexual identity. Anti-fatness and fat shaming are used most often as a way to inspire fear in others. By degrading fat bodies and modeling hatred of fatness widely and publicly. To terrorize the self, by inducing a profound fear of fatness, and to silence the obvious links between misogyny and the control of bodies. In doing so, the hatred of fatness comes to feel inevitable, real, and immutable. Anti-fat rhetoric relies on deeply felt emotions and affect to sustain itself and grow. The intense fear of fatness pushed on fat bodies, and maintained rigorously in thin bodies, works in tandem with structural forms of fat oppression, manifested in a wide variety of institutions that pervade daily life. From schools and workplaces that do not accommodate fat bodies, with their small chairs and improperly sized desks, to forms of transport that exclude or limit fat bodies, air travel and commuter rail, to reductionistic and offensive media representations, see The Whale, to failures in the medical field to provide even the most basic accommodation for fat bodies. MRI machines that aren't big enough, blood pressure cuffs meant for smaller bodies, improperly dosed vaccines, and incorrectly sized speculums. Structural forms of oppression limit and disempower fat bodies relentlessly. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated the pervasive negative effect surrounding fat bodies, revealing the fusion of structural and effective responses to fatness. Many pandemic narratives either ignored the link between higher body weight and COVID mortality rates, or blamed fat people for making themselves more vulnerable to COVID, neither of which helped protect fat people in any meaningful way. The near-catastrophic level of fat death during the pandemic, and the refusal to take seriously what this means for fat vulnerability and risk, put in stark terms the disdain placed on fat bodies and fat lives. In essence, messaging around fat death is nothing new, but the pandemic ratcheted up those fears in painful ways. In this book, I seek to better understand how and why this terror of fatness exists as an accepted reality for so many people, and how we can work to unpack and undo some of that damage. In particular, I direct energy toward foregrounding the experiences of fat women, recognizing the cultural baggage they face that links their value and their appearance in insidious ways. When looking for stories that counter the invisibility of fat lives, or that work against the fear-mongering and body-shaming tactics so often present in body politics, There is a notable lack of content outside of fat activist spaces that seeks any real.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?